All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about a principle we actually already talked about in the video on memory transients, or pre-charging is one of them. But we basically talked about the intermittent nature of charging, right? So we're actually going to go over that in more detail in this video. I just call it energy intermittency or charging intermittency, right? So basically, when we spoke about pre-charging, right, we basically talked about how you can only pre-charge for about 10 seconds, right? So that's the time when your negative memory is in a transient state, and then after roughly about 10 seconds, it just acts as normal negative. It basically reaches steady state for negative memory, and it functions at full power, right? So because of that, you can only pre-charge for 10 seconds. But with the main charging technique, in theory, you can pretty much charge forever, right? Because you're now charging after negative memory has reached that steady state, and you're charging in the face of the effect of negative memory. Now, just to go over this first point, right? Although you can charge using the main technique indefinitely, you're probably not going to want to, right? And the reason why is for this second point, which is that subconscious charging favors intermittency, right? And we basically talked a little bit about that before. So just to kind of go over it again, when I was first studying all of this stuff, right, and I was first learning how to control my subconscious and get the hang of getting it to do what I wanted to do, which is pretty much always charging in some specific way, when I started to get the hang of it, I started to notice that it would respond better and I could get it to charge better when I charged in short intervals. So basically, the example I think I gave before is if take a phone, right? So when you have a USB cord and plug it into the wall, right? Some people call it a block. I call it a transformer. But when you plug the USB into the transformer, which is plugged into the wall, let's say you plug it in and you just leave it in, right? And you want your phone to charge as fast as possible. Basically, the way you would do that is just leaving the plug in, and presumably it'll just charge in the you'll have the most amount of charge in per unit time, in some interval of time. However, let's say that I kept unplugging the charger from the wall within some unit of time, let's say 30 minutes, right? I unplug it for 5 minutes and plug it back in. Unplug it for 5 minutes and then plug it back in, right? Obviously, the phone is not going to charge as fast with me doing that compared to when I just left the plug in the charger plugged into the wall, right? But if the phone charged like your subconscious mind did, it actually would charge faster by doing that. So if I unplug it for 5 minutes, then plug it in, and unplug it for 5 minutes and plug it in, right? The phone would actually charge faster that way than just leaving it plugged in the whole time if it charged like your subconscious mind. So I know that's very strange behavior of the subconscious, but that's what I learned about it, right? We're actually going to talk about why that is. But the subconscious actually favors very short charging intervals, basically short charging sessions over, it favors short intervals over the course of multiple sessions throughout the day, rather than super long sessions, right? So when I was first learning how to charge, I would charge in like intervals of like a whole hour, right? When I was trying to charge my subconscious to feel some emotion, I'd listen to music and I would just kind of keep trying to feel more emotion for like one whole hour. So kind of a long time in charging intervals, right? But I didn't know that at the time. So it didn't work as well, right? And then eventually I learned that when I got better at charging, I learned it was better to charge in really short intervals, actually. So basically, talk a little bit about it here, but I would start off in intervals of almost like 30 seconds to only a few minutes and then stop, right? And then throughout the day, I would keep doing that. I would wait maybe, it could depend on how busy I am or whatever. Like I said, the energy sticks around for 7 days, so it's not too important, but I may do it like maybe 30 minutes later or an hour, sometimes 15 minutes later, so it depends. But I do it multiple times throughout the day, and I noticed I was charging faster and my subconscious was becoming more volatile, right? So why is it better to charge in multiple sessions, short sessions, rather than long and continuous sessions? Well, the beginning of the reason has to do with this point. So to go over this point, it's important to remember that both positive and negative memory actually build up during the charging phase, right? So when you're charging, it's not like it's just positive memory. Even if you're using the main charging technique, it's not just positive memory that's developing. You actually are still building negative memory too. And that's because it's basically it's a normal phase where subconscious entropy is still occurring, right? Now, in the pre-charging, it's a subconscious entropy dead zone, right? So ostensibly, there's still a little bit of negative memory because transient negative memory is still reaching full power. It's not completely ineffective. However, we can approximate it to say that it's a dead zone and there's virtually no effect from negative memory. So when you're pre-charging or you're in a pre-charge session where negative memory is in a transient state, positive memory builds very easily, right? Because the effect of negative memory is virtually gone. That's not the case when you're in the main charging phase, right? So when you're in the main charging phase, subconscious entropy is now trying to occur at its normal rate, or at full power. And in fact, that actually brings us to another point here, which this is a new term that I call the subconscious entropy rate. So that's just a term I made up, and basically it refers to how fast the subconscious is building negative memory relative to some subject, right? So a good circumstance to kind of focus on, or you could get a sense of the entropy rate, is when something's new to you, right? So when something's new, right, and there's no negative memory, it can be very easy for you to feel emotionally stimulated and excited by it, right? Like a new song. And that's because positive memory, the subconscious memory associated with the song, which is the subject, is becoming more and more and more positive. And it's becoming very positive very easily because there's no negative memory, or not a lot of it yet, to sort of keep your subconscious in its ground state, or to cause it to have a very high affinity for the ground state while you're focused on that subject. However, it is still building, right? So subconscious negative memory is still building. It's just building up very, I won't say slowly. It's actually building up faster than positive memory. It's just not very effective yet, right? So when a song is new and you build positive memory, you feel a lot of emotion, but you're also building negative memory. And as you keep building more and more negative memory, eventually there's so much of it actually overtakes your positive memory and starts to become have a stronger effect on your subconscious than the positive memory. And what that means is your subconscious now has a harder time entering its excited state, which means you have a harder time entering a transcendental state. And because of that, it's harder to focus on the subject in a way that makes the memory more positive. So as you keep focusing on, this is basically a reflection of subconscious entropy, which is the phenomenon where your subconscious favors its ground state. And so as a negative memory builds more and more and more, it basically starts to get old, and when you focus on it, it's hard to feel any emotion. And so we basically graphed the function that describes how a subconscious energy when you're focused on something that's new, right? So it basically goes like this. So initially it starts off when there's no negative memory. It starts off like this, and then it charges. But as negative memory keeps building up, which it was building up from the beginning, it just wasn't that much of it yet, and it was actually building up faster than positive memory. But as it keeps building up, right, eventually it overtakes the positive memory, and that's basically when it reaches the equilibrium point, and then your experience or the emotional stimulation starts to drop more and more because negative memory is building up more and more and more, and the net amount of negative memory becomes so much greater than the positive memory, the net amount of negative memory becomes so great that it just becomes harder and harder for your subconscious to enter its excited state. So that's basically entropy rate. So when you're charging, you're always building both negative and positive memory when you're not pre-charging. Now the thing about to go over this next point, the entropy rate, or the subconscious entropy rate, can actually increase during the main charging phase due to human error. So what do I mean by that? Actually, there's actually one other thing I wanted to talk about before going over this point. When you're holding an intention, right, during the main charging phase, that actually has the effect of reducing the entropy rate. So the entropy rate is not actually a fixed value, right? As soon as negative memory reaches steady state, the entropy rate isn't fixed, right? It can actually change, right? Which is why I find it useful to define the term. When you're actually main charging, so when you're holding an intention, right, until you enter, for about 7 to 10 seconds, until you enter a transcendental state, and you're doing it while at the same time telling a story in your mind, right, that phenomenon, when you do that, it actually creates a kind of pressure, right, on the subconscious, which is basically what it feels like to me, but it creates a pressure on the subconscious which reduces the entropy rate. It slows down how fast your subconscious can build negative memory, which is helpful to you because that allows you to, that allows you to build a more positive memory, right? It's not, your subconscious isn't building negative memory as quickly as it can when you're not holding any intention. But here's the problem, right? Although the entropy rate is lower when you're holding an intention and telling a story, and then you're doing that until you enter a transcendental state, and then you acquiesce to the daydream state, which is just another term I use for transcendental state. Then you switch to doing everything with your subconscious instinct over your normal intention or negative mind. As you do all of that, right, which decreases the entropy rate, it is still possible for human error to occur. So what do I mean by that? Basically meaning that if I don't do all that, let's say my mind wanders and I think about something else, or I forget to do all this stuff, because you kind of have to, it takes a little bit of effort to do these things with your mind. If I don't do all that fancy stuff with my intention, I just focus on the subject, then the entropy rate goes right back to its normal value, presumably its maximum value. And negative memory just starts building up at its normal rate. So what that means is basically if I do a main charge, right, and I make my mind wanders or I don't do what I'm supposed to do, which is human error, entropy rate occurs normally and negative memory builds up faster. And to go over this point, the longer and more continuous a charging session is, the greater the possibility of human error, which is cumulative, right? In other words, the more mistakes I make in terms of not doing what I need to do to keep the entropy rate low, the low rate it goes to when using the main charging technique, then the more negative memory will build up. So each mistake has a cumulative effect. It builds up more and more. It's more costly each time I do it. Each time I make some mistake like that relative to a charge. And so because of that, to go over this point, it is generally best to charge in relatively short intervals, ranging from about 30 seconds to a few minutes, right? So that's basically how I start when I'm charging, right? So I think I forgot to mention it last video. When you're first beginning a charge, right, the effect, I did mention this, I believe, in chapter 8, but I should have really reviewed it. But when you're first entering a when you're first charging, right, so your subconscious memory doesn't have a lot of positive memory relative to some charge. Actually, when you we talked about pre-charging, so what I'm about to say now doesn't apply as much if you've pre-charged, right? That's kind of the whole point. But let's say you don't pre-charge and you just go right into the main charge. Entering a transcendental state is very, very subtle because you haven't charged very much, right? So that feeling of your mind trying to enter a daydream when you hold intention for about 7 to 10 seconds, it's very subtle and it's not very strong, right? So you have to kind of catch it and be aware of that feeling, because if you don't know about all these stuff and all these principles, you'll probably just miss it, right? Because you won't even notice it because it's not that strong. The compulsion isn't that strong, and you don't go that deep into a transcendental state. So if you know these principles, you kind of have to catch it, right? When you feel your mind trying to enter a transcendental state, then you give into it, which is acquiescence. So you want to just kind of you stop holding the intention, you just let your mind kind of drift into a daydream-like state. And in the beginning of the charge, it's very weak, so you have to kind of catch it and make an effort to sort of allow your mind to drift. But, as you charge more and more and more, then it gets very strong, right? And the affinity for your subconscious to enter an excited state, and for your the affinity for your mind to enter for your subconscious to enter an excited state and for your conscious mind to enter a transcendental state is very strong. So when you hold the intention for about 7 to 10 seconds, at that point it's like you can't miss it. When your mind is trying to enter a daydream, it's very easy to catch it. So when you first begin a charge, and let's say you main charge for, like I said, 30 seconds roughly. That's what I do, right? So when I'm first charging, I roughly do it for about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and then I stop, right? I'll stop, then I'll wait. Like I said, there's no real important time frame here because the energy sticks around for roughly 7 days. It does decrease, right, each day, but it sticks around long enough where it's not too bad. So I may do another main charging session maybe 15 minutes later, maybe an hour later, but I'll basically do it multiple times throughout the day for some charge that I'm dedicated to, right? I'm dedicated to in that moment. All I have to do is main charge a few times throughout the day, like I said, roughly a few seconds to maybe a minute or so, and I'm going to notice that each time I do this, that the feeling of the charge is more intense, right? It's more powerful, and that's because it's actually charging, right? And so if I charge in longer intervals, right, it's going to be much harder for me to build energy, and that's because there's much more human error that can occur. If I keep charging in short intervals, there's far less human error. It's far easier to control human error, I should say, and so the subconscious memory associated with the subject is just becoming more and more and more positive, right? Now the effect is the effect is very subtle at the beginning of the charge, right? So you're not going to notice how much negative memory you're accumulating due to human error at the beginning of a charge versus how much you're not doing when using a short timing interval. But like I said, the effect is cumulative. So as you keep doing charging in short intervals, the subconscious memory is going to become more and more and more and more positive. And eventually, it's going to become so positive, and there's going to be so little negative memory there that your subconscious is going to be net amount of positive memory is going to overtake the amount of positive memory is going to overtake the amount of negative memory, and the net positive memory is going to increase so much that it's going to reflect a subconscious charge, and you're going to reach higher levels of charge. Now, there's one more phenomenon that's important to talk about here, and that's basically is that when you do this, it creates kind of an illusion, right? It creates an illusion that you can kind of just keep going forever, right? And so, because this is something I've noticed when I've started practicing charging the proper way, which is in short intervals. Let's say I keep charging in intervals about 30 seconds to a minute, right? My subconscious becomes so volatile, right, that it'll reach a point where I'm like, oh, I can go long. I feel so much emotional stimulation that I know I can go longer without really losing too much, building up too much negative memory and losing my charge too much. So then I might start charging in intervals of about 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and then maybe I can go longer, right? And so I can increase the interval of timing without really building or feeling the effects of negative memory too much. And what that does is it creates kind of the illusion almost that there is no negative memory. So eventually I might just go continuously. And so it might be exactly like what happens when something's new to you. So when you listen to a new song, right, and your subconscious, you feel a lot of emotional stimulation from it, you might just keep listening to it, right, nonstop, because you feel so much emotional stimulation and you like it, right? But eventually, and it might feel at first, during the first few times you listen to it, like you can just listen to it forever and feel emotion forever. But eventually, you are going to notice that you're now not feeling as much emotion. And why does that happen? That's because even though at the beginning it didn't feel like negative memory was building up, it actually was, right? It just didn't build up enough for you to notice it, but it was building. And eventually it reached a point where you finally noticed it. So that's the same thing that's true here. When you charge in short timing intervals, it's going to be tempting to just start going longer or focusing on the subject that you're charging while focused on. It's going to be tempting to just focus on it longer or charge in longer intervals. And eventually it's even going to become tempting to just focus on it without doing any of this charging stuff, right? Because when your subconscious is very volatile, then it's very easy to control, to basically use your subconscious instinct and to use it without necessarily doing all this fancy stuff with your intention, which is exactly what happens when something's new. And so it's going to become tempting to do that. And for a while, you're going to feel like you can just do it forever. And you're going to feel like you don't feel any effective negative memory building up, right? So, did I want to say? There's something else I want to say, but it's going to feel like there's no effective negative memory. But that's an illusion, right? It's just an illusion. If you keep going, right, without charging in short timing intervals, eventually you're going to notice that the thing you're focused on is starting to feel old again. You're starting not to feel as much stimulation. And the reason that happens is because you stop charging at short timing intervals. So this was something I've noticed, right? If I charge my subconscious to feel a lot of emotional stimulation while focused on a song, for example, right? If I keep charging while focused on a song at very short intervals, so if I might listen to a song for like 30 seconds to a minute using this technique, and then I stop, right? I wait for maybe 15 minutes, maybe an hour, and then I focus on the song again, and I use the same technique for about 30 seconds to a minute, then I stop, right? And so as I keep doing that, every time I listen to the song, it's going to get more and more and more intense, right? And then eventually, I can now go for about 2 minutes, I can go for about 3 minutes, you know what I mean? And then I could go longer. And what's really happening is my subconscious has so much charge and it's so volatile that it has a lot of leeway, basically. Now I can listen to it without even using the charging technique. I can I can absorb or take the effect of some negative memory without really it being really that consequential because I have so much charge, right? So I'm allowed to get some without it affecting me too much. However, if I keep listening to that song over and over continuously, then I'm going to start to notice my emotional stimulation drop and I don't feel as much stimulation from it, right? So that's basically what I want to talk about. So when you charge in these short intervals, eventually your subconscious is going to get so volatile that it creates the illusion that you no longer need to do this and you can just keep going or keep focusing on it and keep feeling stimulation and you don't even have to do the main charge anymore. But as you do that, eventually it's going to catch up to you and you're going to realize like, oh, no, negative memory was building and I was basically losing charge even though I didn't notice it at first. Now, eventually you are going to want to do this because you're not going to want to just charge forever, right? Or you may just stop focusing on the subject and allow your subconscious, the positive subconscious memory to discharge, right? Because it discharges while in a passive state. And to just go over this last point, I just say that I'm not sure if it's possible to main charge indefinitely to reach higher levels of charge, right? It might be, but in my experience, when you let's say I main charge for like 2 hours, right? So that's in charging time, that's a really long time, right? So if I charge for like 2 hours straight, right? In my experience, it's never been the case that I've reached these really high levels because I've been charging so long. Like, no, right? So negative memory will develop and it's just going to block you, right? It's going to block you from charging. And this is something a lot of people who try to reach these higher levels of mental ability and mental capability, they keep thinking that the more effort they give mentally, right, or the longer they give an effort mentally, right, the more it's going to pay dividends for them. That's not how the subconscious works. So it has almost like anomalous behavior, right? It kind of reminds me of the anomalous behavior of water. I haven't looked this up. I read this in a physics book years ago. So I think I probably should re-look it up. But like I said, the physicists or the science people will fact check me if this is true. But I remember reading how it said the anomalous behavior of water is that it actually contracts from 0, I think, to 4 degrees Celsius. Right, and that actually was that phenomenon actually helped life form, right? But normally when something heats up, it expands. For whatever reason, they actually do know the reason, I forgot what it was, but water actually contracts instead of expands from 0 to 4 degrees. And so, and that's considered to be anomalous behavior from the way most things behave as they heat up. So this is similar, right? With energy, you would expect the longer you try to accumulate energy, the more you're going to get. No, but the subconscious, it has anomalous behavior, right? If you do it in relatively short intervals, in broken up time periods, it charges faster than just a long continuous interval. And like I said, in my experience, if you just charge in just charging a really long time, even using the main technique, I've never felt like I could reach higher levels that way. I always feel the effect of negative memory blocking me. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's the principle of energy intermittency. Now there are more principles that there are other things we're going to talk about to reduce the entropy rate for the main charging technique, and but we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. So that has to do with what I call the burst action and the role of your attention, please. So we'll talk about the next chapter. We don't really need to go into it now. You can actually practice this. I recommend to practice this a little bit now. Then we'll actually talk about other parameters that allow to make the main charging technique even more powerful, right? So it reduces the entropy rate even more, right? So that's it for now. The next chapter we're going to talk about deep charging, which, just like before, we kind of already went over the principles. I believe is in chapter 10 from last chapter, but we're just going to talk about it again in terms of the main charging technique, right? So that's it for now. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.